Town of Los Gatos of May 17th. If we could start with a roll call, please.
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Sayak.
Here.
Councilmember Hudas.
Here.
Councilmember Badami.
Here.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Rennie.
And I'm here also. So we have everybody in attendance. If you could roll the meeting decorum video, please.
The public is welcome to participate at town council meetings, understanding that the purpose of the meetings is to conduct the important business of the town in an efficient and effective manner. At each meeting, the following expectations of civil conduct shall apply. 1. For the benefit of the entire community, the town of Los Gatos asks that all speakers follow the town's meeting guidelines by treating everyone with respect and dignity. This is done by following meeting guidelines set forth in state law, in the town code, and on the cover sheet of the council agenda. 2. The town embraces diversity and strongly condemns hate speech and offensive hateful language or racial intolerance of any kind at council meetings. 3. Town council and staff are well aware of the public's right to disagree with their professional opinion on various town issues. However, antisocial behavior, slander, hatred, and bigotry statements are completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form at town council meetings. 4. All public comments at the town council meeting must pertain to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the town and shall not contain slanderous statements, hatred, and bigotry against non-public officials. 5. The town will go through the following steps if a disturbance results from a member of the public not following these rules. If participating remotely, town staff may mute the individual with an explanation for the record of why muting occurred consistent with this policy. If participating in person, the mayor may call a recess for violation of this policy, resulting in the immediate cessation of the audio and video recording and the council exiting the chamber. Staff will determine if the individual should be removed or if all members of the public should leave, depending on the extent of the disturbance. In the event that all public members exit, only the press would be allowed back in the meeting. Once the individual or individuals leave, the council would return to the chamber and the mayor would resume the meeting. Persons disrupting a council meeting may be cited for violation of the California Penal Code Section 403. These expectations of conduct also apply to meetings of all town boards, committees, and commissions.
Thank you. So next we will go to council and manager matters. This is an opportunity for council members to tell us what they've been working on since the last council meeting. Council member Hudas, would you like to kick us off?
Let's see. I guess first thing was a lot of finance commission meetings. There was one on Monday the 9th. It was a special meeting to look at the budget, and the finance commission made some recommendations. I think are all included in the staff report tonight. It was a big meeting for the Finance Commission. I met with the road mapping subcommittee of the Senior Services Committee on Wednesday the 11th to figure out how to get a recommendation to the council in June and then in the fall on the roadmap. Then let's see, I guess there was also a Senior Services Committee work plan committee meeting on Monday yesterday. And that's all the meetings that I attended. Thanks.
Okay, great. Councilmember Sayak, what have you been working on?
Thank you. Well, in addition to community meetings, there was a cannabis community meeting. I know that's of high concern to members of our community, so I participated only as a guest to listen. There was a Housing Element Advisory Board. Both Vice Mayor Risto and I both sit on that, and there's another one on Thursday. Silicon Valley Clean Energy, I did participate in that as an alternate for you, Mayor Rennie, and Cities Association of Santa Clara County had both their executive committee meeting as well as their regular board of directors meeting. Nothing of substantial to report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Badami.
Thank you. On May 4th, I also attended the community workshop on commercial cannabis as a guest. On May 5th, I attended the West Valley Clean Water Authority board meeting. And later that same afternoon, I attended the West Valley Solid Waste Management Authority board meeting. On May 7th, I attended the Chamber of Commerce ribbon cutting for Montebello Market. And this is an exciting fit for the downtown right across from the town plaza. On May 9th, I also attended the Finance Commission meeting as an observer. And I've also met with community members regarding commercial cannabis and the draft 2040 general plan.
All right, thank you. Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. In addition to a variety of meetings, watching commissions and meeting with community members, plus the meetings that were mentioned by Councilmember Sayak, I also attended the Cannabis Community Workshop to hear the input there. I think a number of us were at the Kiwanis Turnaround Scholarship Luncheon last week, and I just have to say that was really inspiring. I've always enjoyed the fact that that scholarship exists, and I love the fact that I think there's always an opportunity to improve, to change, and I love the fact that we have young people that are recognized and rewarded for that. Just really, really a heartwarming series of stories. I attended the Los Gatos Service Providers meeting, which I want to thank Councilmember Sayak for putting together, I think a year or so ago. And it's a great way to see what the status is of the various groups that provide service in our communities. So something I look forward to continuing. I think Councilmember Badami and I were at Conceptual Design Advisory Committee last week. It was not a huge issue for the community, but it was regarding a lot in a plan development and how that could move forward. West Valley Sanitation District, nothing of serious note. We just adopted the budget for the upcoming year, and there was no public input and not a lot of discussion. It was pretty straightforward. On behalf of the mayor, I attended the VTA PAC meeting, and the main issue that would affect Los Gatos and would matter are, we discussed the One Bay area, the OBAG Cycle 3 project, and program selection criteria, and that'll be moving forward to the board. And then last night or yesterday afternoon, the mayor and I interviewed the youth commission candidates. And I would have to say that some of these youth have done more by high school than I've done in my entire life. And if these 20 candidates are even remotely indicative of some of the youth we have, our future is in very good hands. So that was a real high point for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And since the last meeting on May 4th, I attended the BACMed, our Air District Board meeting. On the 5th of May, I attended the Special Olympics fundraiser at Campo de Bocce. I gave the welcome, and also a number of our officers volunteered to put on the cornhole competition there. So I want to thank our police department for all their support to help make that fundraiser successful. On 5/7, I did a ribbon cutting for the Montebello market with several other council members in attendance. This market's just on the town plaza. So that was exciting. They also were doing a Derby, Kentucky Derby Day screen event there at the same time. So that was kind of fun. So check out the new Montebello market. On 5/9, the Silicon Valley Clean Energy had a special board meeting that I attended. Also 5/9, the BACMed Air District Legislative Committee met. And as Councilmember Huda said, Finance Commission on 5/9. On 5/11, I spoke to the Silvar Realtors Group and gave an update about Los Gatos and Silicon Valley Clean Energy and BACMed and the other government things that I was involved in. On 5/11, the town manager and I had a meeting with HCD where we were talking about how do we build affordable housing in our town, and they also gave us some more, I'd say some more insights on how to get through our housing element. On 5/11, I also met with the manager and the Los Gatos Unified High School District Superintendent and the Los Gatos High School principal. And we discussed, one of the things we discussed was access to the back of the high school if the lodge ever redevelops. And we discussed other issues, and I was curious about other kinds of things that were going on campus. On 5/13, the BACMed Technology Implementation Committee met, and I'm the chair of that. We discussed climate tech financing, electric vehicle infrastructure, how it's transitioning, and light duty electric vehicle, all updates on how we see those progressing in our area. And also we did on 5/17, we had a special meeting for Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority. And that is it for me. I would like, before I go to managers, I'd like to introduce our new town attorney, Gabrielle Whalen. She comes to us from the city of San Mateo, and more importantly, her alma mater is Dartmouth, where I also went to grad school. Would you like to give us a little more introduction, Ms. Whalen?
I'm very excited to join the town. I do love municipal law, and I've practiced in the East Bay and most recently on the peninsula. I'm looking forward to, working on all different aspects of it. My focus in the last few years has been land use, but I'm interested in everything. And I'm just very excited to be here. So thank you.
Welcome. We're very excited to have you. Looking forward to working with you and lots in the future. So I'll go to manager matters now.
Thank you, Mayor, and welcome, Gabrielle, to our team. We're really excited to have you join us. Thank you. So first up, as was mentioned, our Housing Element Advisory Board is meeting on Thursday to continue its work on selecting sites for our new housing element and to identify affordability levels for those sites. So please join us on Zoom for that. We are continuing our adult recruitment for boards and commissions. There's lots of great opportunities to volunteer with the town. Applications are due May 27th and interviews will be held on June 7th. We are also scheduling our general plan public hearing with the town council for June 20th. So please put that on your calendar. There will be more information posted to the 2040 general plan website, but we welcome all community members to participate in this important process. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next up is our consent calendar, which consists of items 1 through 6. Would any members of council wish to pull an item from our consent calendar? Looks like seeing no hands. Would any member of the public wish to comment on items on our consent calendar? Seeing no hands, I'll close the public comment. Would any members of council wish to comment on any items on the consent calendar? Councilmember Sack.
No comments, just move for approval for items 1 through 6 on consent.
Councilmember Badami.
I'll second the motion.
All right. Any other comments? Doesn't look like it. So I will call the question for the consent calendar. Councilmember Sayak.
Aye.
Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Aye.
And Councilmember Hudas.
Aye.
And the mayor votes aye. Consent calendar consisting of items 1 through 6 passes unanimously. Next up is verbal communication. This is an opportunity for members of the public to talk to us for 3 minutes on items that are not on tonight's agenda. Our only item on the agenda is our budget. Would any members of the public wish to address us? And let's start with Carl Gardino.
Mayor and members of the council, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Mayor and members of the council and town manager Privetti. My name is Carl Guardino. I'm proud to serve as executive vice president for Bloom Energy, a clean, resilient energy company founded right here in Silicon Valley with nearly 800 local employees and currently hiring for more than 300 additional advanced manufacturing careers. Over the past 2 years, we've all learned more than ever the vital role of our frontline hospital and healthcare workers, all pulling together and putting our health before their own throughout the COVID-19 crisis. In recognition of that selfless work, Bloom Energy hosted the inaugural Stars and Strides community run last year and raised more than $250,000 to benefit the Valley Medical Center Foundation. And I'm here tonight to invite you to come and build on that success on Saturday morning, July 2nd, for our second annual Stars and Strides community run as we support and celebrate our frontline hospital workers and the 1 million local patients they serve annually. Our ambitious goals for our second annual Stars and Strides community run will be much more attainable with your help and participation. Goal 1, raise and donate $350,000 to the VMC Foundation. Goal number 2 is to pull together 2,500 participants in downtown San Jose for our Armature Systems 10K run, our Silicon Valley Bank 5K run, or our HP Kids Fun Run. And third, we'll have 400 caring volunteers to make sure we all have a fun, safe, and healthy experience. Our Bloom Energy Stars and Strides community run will start and finish at the beautiful Discovery Meadow in downtown San Jose. And if you're out of town that weekend, you have no excuse because we have our Bank of America Step Up in Spirit virtual run or walk. So I have 3 quick requests tonight. First, I hope you'll consider registering for yourself and your family. You all lead by example. You're used to running for office. Now we can run for charity. And that's at starsandstridesrun.com. Second, please consider reaching out to your vast database of community members to also join us throughout Los Gatos. And third, we'd be honored to work with your professional staff to be included in any online community communications between now and race day. Over the past 2 years, we've all realized just how critical healthcare workers and healthcare is to our communities. We have a chance to say thank you on July 2nd.
Thank you, Carl, for all you're doing to make Stars and Strides happen. And thank you to Bloom Energy for all that they're doing also. And thank you to Stars and Strides for all the great things they do for the community. So everybody should join in and help out. Thank you. Next up, Joanne Rogers.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening. I would like to ask some why questions tonight. Maybe you can provide the answers at our next individual meeting. First, why would you think that our family-friendly town of Los Gatos would want cannabis money to pay for services we enjoy when we've had other opportunities to raise revenue for the town? Why has the town become so desperate for revenue that we would want drug money? Who's responsible? Why and how did we get to this point? From what I understand, it is because some bad decisions have been made along the way. Bad decisions have consequences. I'm thinking of how the North 40 looks, for example. The consequences are why many of us are very concerned about this. Why, when we had an appointed finance commission, as well as a volunteer citizen finance committee, then why did the council vote down a suggestion to increase the sales tax rate by 0.5%, especially when the citizens backed this tax increase by 64% in favor? I understand that would have brought in $4.8 million today. Rob Rennie, I believe you were on that voting block, and maybe you could answer that. Why were the commission and the committee's recommendations voted down? Now, why would we spend $50,000 to study if 1 or 2 drug dispensaries will fill our coffers when we have not seen any financial analysis? Cannabis and its paraphernalia is a cash business with up to 30% taxes applied to the price, and the illegal sales will always be cheaper than the legal dispensaries. Why have few or no locations been identified where those storefronts could go and would be out of range of the kids? A relatively simple process of identification, I believe. When will we see the GIS of potential sites? It is the cart before the horse if we don't have an appropriate location. Why would we need dispensaries when San Jose has potentially 33 and cannabis is available 15 minutes away to any Los Gatos adults who need it? Is it because one of the council members put it this way? She said we need a full service town. Well, then we need to add casinos, brothels, gun stores for a full service town. Why won't the citizens see the results of the newest survey and the impact on our police department until June 21st, the night of the vote? And what's the cost of that survey? Add that to the $50,000 that we've already paid. I feel this decision is all about money and no consideration for the safety of our kids and the character of our town. I want to thank you for all you do, and thank you for listening to me night after night. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. I don't see any hands up for questions. I think everybody understood clearly. Next up, Jim Handy, and if I remember correctly, a former Parks Commissioner from a long time ago.
Sorry, I was muted. So yes, Rob, I appreciate the fact that you remember me, and I want to start off just by thanking all of you for what you've done for the town, what you're doing now, and also for the opportunity to use Zoom for communicating rather than actually attending a meeting, because my family is very sensitive to the possibility of still COVID infections. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here just to ask for a little bit of a change to the town code. We have a kind of a tricky neighbor in this town, and your code compliance officer, Alan Meyer, was able to do a just wonderful job of getting this situation resolved. This is somebody who starts projects and never finishes, and who has had storage containers in their driveway for years at a time, that kind of stuff. And those are things that fall within the code. Well, the latest thing was a portable toilet that stayed in the front yard for 6 months before I called up code compliance. And I said, can something be done about this? And Alan Meyer took it under his wing to do something, but he found out that there was no code against residents having a porta potty in the front yard. There was a code against contractors doing something like that, but apparently we're just kind of missing a law. Now, somehow or another, he was able to get it removed. It took several tries, and it didn't seem like it was the most pleasant task in the world for him to do. So, I'm very appreciative to him for doing that. But, I wanted to ask town council if you could find a way to add something to the code that would help solve this problem. Not just for me, but for anybody who has this problem in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Handy. Let me request that maybe you send an email to our new town attorney. I'm sure her email address is probably gwhelan at losgatosca.gov.
It is, and also I can spell Whalen, WHELAN.
Thank you.
And that will be good. That way she'll have your contact information and can follow up if she has any questions.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, Susan Burnett.
Good evening, and thank you for listening to me. I'm speaking on the cannabis dispensaries. I think it's pretty simple. If you had a ledger and you had the pros and the cons, and you had the pros, which would be the money income coming into the town of Los Gatos, And I think if it did come to Los Gatos, it would only be storefront. So then we'd have to, the money coming in would not be as much that we would get. So that's on the one side of the ledger, why we should have it. And then you look at the other side of the ledger, the negative. And there are so many negatives. I mean, we have a Los Gatos brand that is a family town. Now, I know there are good parts to cannabis and medical purposes, but really, we're sending the wrong message to our kids. Second of all, traffic. I mean, where they want to put these dispensaries, we have a lot of traffic issues. So you're going to have people coming to Los Gatos to buy the supplies they need when they can actually, most of the number was Los Gatos residents that used it were 2,000 and they expect 280 more. That was at one of the meetings that I heard. And so those are the people in Los Gatos that presently get it, and they either buy it or they have it mailed to them. And that won't go away. They can still do that. The other part is crime. We're going to be talking about probably some crime occurring. Then you have the increased cost of policing, which we're still working on. I know our town manager is working with the police chief on that, what that expense is going to be. And then we'll have some unexpected expenses and negative consequences. So what I'm saying to you is, in the long run, for the monies that we might gain, do you really want one positive reason to have it? And you have maybe, 8 to 10 reasons why you shouldn't have it? I think it's sort of like an IQ test, to tell you the truth. I don't think we really need it. I think there's other ways. I mean, we're building a bridge. What are we building? What is it, $10 million that I may be way off on that, but that's what I heard. We're putting a lot of money into projects that maybe we don't need all these projects right now. Just saying, to me, it's just sort of black and white. I just don't think we need it. And we won't be depriving our citizens of having it or getting it. Thank you so much. And you all work so hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burnett. Ms. Burnett, is there anybody else wishes to address us on items not on the agenda? Not seeing any, I will close verbal communication for items not on the agenda. And we will move to the main event, item number 7, which is our budget. Turn that over to staff.
Thank you, Mayor and Town Council. And this evening we are presenting the budget, but you will recall that the budget was actually posted back on April 18th. But per Measure A, the budget first gets reviewed by our Finance Commission. And so our Finance Commission has reviewed it on 3 different occasions. They held 1 regular meeting and 2 special meetings. And then you will see later tonight that we'll present their recommendations along with the rest of the presentation that I have. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and do a screen share. Great. Does everybody see the presentation? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, looks good.
Thank you, Mayor. So in putting together the budget for fiscal year 22-23, there were a couple key principles that were adopted by staff as we started to put it together. One was, it's basically a status quo budget. You won't see any new significant programming in this budget. It does maintain current existing service levels, but we did need to augment capacity with some one-time temporary hour requests and a couple modest staffing additions. It does provide for limited infrastructure improvements, and we'll talk a little more about that later. And it was able to address many of Council's strategic priorities that were adopted back in February. So basically, we have a total budget of about $50.4 million. Revenues that also equal $50.4 million. As I mentioned earlier, we endeavored to maintain the essential services we currently have, but also trying to control costs, because as you'll see a little later, The 5-year forecast continues to predict shortfalls throughout the forecast period. So in order to balance the budget, there were two primary strategies. I mentioned earlier, it was a status quo budget. And by that, we go to all the departments and meet with them, and we ask them to go ahead, figure out a way to program your existing resources, either by maintaining your current structures, or if you're able to realign operations in a more effective, efficient way, please go ahead and do that. But all in all, to try and stay within your budget from last year. In addition, departments were given guidance that if you do need additional capacity, try to do it in one-time, non-benefited ways. And so that's either through limit dated, temporary hours, or non-benefited personnel options wherever possible. At the end of the day, there was still about $1 million deficit for this year's budget. And so we used $1 million of the town's ARPA allocation of $7.2 million. This is consistent with council action we've received last year, where in fiscal year 2021, we looked at using 1.4 million. In fiscal year 21-22, we looked at utilizing approximately 1.9 million. While we're on the subject of ARPA and budget balancing strategies, as I mentioned, when we were closing out fiscal year 2021, it looked as if we were going to have a projected deficit of about 1.3 million. At the close of that year, it actually required no ARPA funding. There was not a deficit, and so there was actually no use of ARPA funds for that. Very similar situation to last year, fiscal year 21-22. We anticipated needing 1.9 million ARPA funding, and our current estimates, we'll still have to close out the books, but our current estimates are that, once again, we won't require any ARPA funding. However, as I mentioned, for fiscal year 22-23, we currently estimate a deficit of about 1 million. And so you will see the budget is currently balanced, utilizing that 1 million. Also, while we're discussing ARPA, just to refresh council's memory, of the 7.2 million and the 1 million I just mentioned as recommended for balancing the 22-23 budget, there have been economic development allocations totaling about 1.3 million. There have been nonprofit and community assistance allocations totaling about 1.2 million. And so all total, there's still approximately 3.7 million in unallocated ARPA funds to date. So I mentioned that while we've been able to close budgets in the current year, in 2021 without utilizing ARPA, the budget balanced itself ultimately. 21-22, it appears as if the budget is going to balance itself. For 22-23, as I mentioned, we anticipate about $1 million deficit. But you can see throughout the rest of the forecast period, even though current years continue to appear to right themselves, the forecast has fairly consistent deficits ranging anywhere between $2 and $3 million. There are some nuances to the forecast, and I want to go over a couple of the bigger nuances. As I just mentioned, it appears as if as we close out the books, some of these nuances end up in the favor of the town and we end up balancing the budget organically. The forecast includes 2% COLA assumptions. You'll remember last year, per the commission recommendation and council, we now do run a consistent 2% COLA recommendation throughout the forecast period. The forecast does assume 100% staffing, and this is where we see some of the budget balancing itself in the current year as we start to recognize the vacancy savings. But for the forecast, it does assume 100% staffing. You'll also recall that we talked about some of the nuances around ERAF, one of the components of property tax. The forecast only budgets about $400,000 in ERAF, but as we move through the year and we start to get better guidance from the county assessor, they start to indicate that we can now increase that to about 70-80% of the projected allocation. And in the past several years, that's equated to an additional $1 million plus in property tax. So we are concerned that we are starting to see consistent deficits, but you do see that there's also some variables that any one of them can start to either diminish the deficit, especially ERAF. One of the things we've all experienced the last several years, and even though it does look like, some of the elements of the COVID-led recession are behind us, there are still some ramifications to some of our primary revenues. So what this slide shows is our property tax estimates from our municipal services property tax consultant. The green bars reflect actual results, and then the gray bars in the later years show their projections. And so even though we've started to see a pretty good return to pre-pandemic sales tax levels, everything below the blue bar is lost anticipated growth prior to the pandemic. And so even though we are seeing positive signs on revenues, we've still lost a lot of projected growth that it's going to take, according to municipal services, about 5 to 6 years to recapture and get back. So good news on the revenue front, but there was still lost potential growth that it was going to take a little while. And this is consistent with TOT and other economically sensitive revenues also, other than property tax, which continue to perform well throughout the pandemic. So also tonight, you will be looking at the capital improvement plan for 22-23, and then also for their forward projection. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, there's limited opportunity for new projects. This is the result of ongoing difficulty finding revenue sources to fund the CIP. So the CIP concentrates on key ongoing maintenance commitments. It also concentrates on projects with grant funding and grant funding that requires a 22-23 schedule obligation. And in the past, you received a report on unfunded needs of the CIP, and those unfunded needs still persist today. And those are in facilities maintenance, stormwater infrastructure, pavement maintenance, and the ADA transition plan. Just to orient everyone again, the way funds typically flow into our CIP program is through the capital and special projects reserves. In the past, a lot of that would come from surpluses. Through some of the past budgetary changes we've done in the last several years to tighten controls on our budgeting, we're seeing fewer and fewer surpluses, but in the past, those monies would then be allocated through council priorities. We went through several years of pension and OPEB, additional discretionary payments being a priority of the council. As I mentioned, it would also flow to GFAR for capital projects. So in the CIP, I mentioned that there's quite a few of council priorities still being addressed. Those include continued vegetation management in our hillsides, development of Measure B transportation projects, the continuation of bicycle and pedestrian improvements, phased implementation of the comprehensive parking study, and as in the past, you've affirmed the exploration of new revenue opportunities. So a little more granular on CIP and the funding sources. The orange box is the one we spoke to earlier. That's funds that come in through the general fund reserve. But then there's also Measure B funds, there's construction impact fees, there's carry forward, and then there's also some very specific traffic mitigation grants, storm drain, that are only allowed for very specific purposes. So all of this combined put together a funding for the 22-23, 26-27 CIP of about $49.5 million. You can see here, and it's also in the budget, all the various revenue sources, including carry forward funding and then new funding. And then as we move to the current year, 22-23, which is the only year that will actually be adopted tonight, you can see we have a total estimate of about $32.5 million in CIP projects, which is a combination of carry forward and new funding. But as I mentioned, the new funding is very limited in nature. So we mentioned that the Finance Commission is the first body to review the proposed budget. They did spend 3 meetings reviewing that budget, and at the culmination of those 3 meetings and included in your staff report, they came up with basically 4 recommendations. The first is the allocation of $3.77 million to the general fund. That's about $700,000 more than what is currently programmed in the budget before you. Then the recommendation for the allocation of approximately $3.7 million of the unallocated ARPA funds. Earlier, I had the chart up that showed of the $7.2 million we were allocated, commitments the council has already allocated funding towards, and then the staff recommendation to use $1 million for balancing the current budget that left about $3.7 million. And so that's where that recommendation comes from. They also have a recommendation for the dissolution of the workers' compensation and the self-insurance internal service funds. And there was more detail of pros and cons on that in the staff report. And then also there's a recommendation for a council to acknowledge the commission's finding that the commission believes a structural financial deficit currently exists, and council direction for the finance commission to work with town management over the course of the next year to quantify the deficits and to come back to council with solutions for curing those deficits. So all of this boils down to basically about 5 potential actions or motions the council can consider this evening. One is if you have any direction you'd like to provide, given the assumptions currently used in the 5-year forecast. Provide direction to balance the fiscal year 22-23 proposed budget. Currently, as the budget stands, there's about $1 million deficit. Staff has a current recommendation to use ARPA funding for that, consistent with the past years. Provide any other direction on the proposed operating budget if there are changes. Provide any other direction on the proposed capital budget if there are any changes. And then lastly, an administrative item is consider the fiscal year 22-23 list of potential donations consistent with the town's donation policy. With that, you have all the senior leadership of the town here. You also have all the fiscal representatives for the departments here. And so we're available for any questions on either the operating budget or the CIP.
I'm on mute. Okay. Council, let me suggest that we take comments from the public first, and then we go and we break it up into the pieces suggested, starting with the Finance Commission's recommendations, see what we want to do there, then go to the list that Mr. Andrews just showed us. If that's okay with everybody, I'll open it up to comments from the public.
Where do you go in that day? Question mark.
Thanks, Tim. So let me start with Rob Stump.
Thank you. Again, my name is Rob Stump, a Hillside resident of Los Gatos, and tonight I want to address the 2022-23 CIP as it relates to roadside fuel reduction. Back in 2020, the Town Council commissioned an ad hoc wildfire committee that I was able to serve on. Top priority was to save lives through preparation and prevention initiatives. Key initiatives include roadside fuel reduction and adequate and clear evacuation routes. This coming year, Los Gatos will not fund fuel reduction work through CIP due to $700,000 in funding that will be received from the federal government. First, the town staff needs to be appointed for securing this funding. It's great work. But we should continue our own funding in the amount of $500,000 to expedite fuel reduction work on the remaining 20 miles of Los Gatos roadside. This would demonstrate focus and urgency. So why is this important? A large percentage of wildfires are started within 50 feet of the roadside. We're entering our 4th year of dry conditions. The importance of addressing fuel along Los Gatos roadways in an expedited manner has never been more important. Roadside fuel reduction also includes weed abatement. County code requires homeowners to abate weeds by May 15. It was this past Sunday. Town also has a weed ordinance. Los Gatos likely has miles of roadway that are not in compliance. Where do the majority of fires begin? Along the roadside. It's easy to say we don't have the funding to do this, but it's the wrong answer. As an example, I sent the council photos of roadside weeds on Foster Road that are the responsibility of the town. While not a CIP funding issue yet, we also need to ensure our evacuation routes have 20 feet of clear width, fire trucks in, residents out. We should be concerned about the potential for increased housing density in the very high fire hazard severity zone, not including the hillside. Increasing densities does not make sense when we're already challenged with narrow streets and existing residential parking challenges. Should we further tax critical evacuation routes by increasing housing density? A logical thinking person would say no. I've also shared some photos of Johnson and Loma Alta Avenue showing street parking on a recent Wednesday afternoon. Parking is maxed out and there's nowhere near 20 feet of clear width on Johnson Avenue. We're setting ourselves up for a worst case traffic scenario in the event of an emergency. So saving lives is the top priority. Roadside fuel reduction, weed abatement, and establishing and maintaining clear evacuation routes are critical to achieving this priority. More funding for wildfire preparation, prevention initiatives, and sound land use policy is required to support these critical initiatives. Again, I just want to thank you for your time.
Mr. Stump, you have a question from Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you, Mr. Stump, for your focus on this very important area. With regard to the 500,000 in capital that you mentioned, I'm interested whether that is, I believe, not currently included in the budget. I wonder if there have been discussions with town staff about that, and how has that dialogue gone on, considering that the ad hoc committee is no longer officially functioning?
Yeah, and again, thank you for that question. Again, I first want to say that the conversation with the town staff has been very positive. And again, the $700,000 is a tremendous benefit to the town of Los Gatos. I guess I'm doubling down. Arn, I hope I'm not blindsiding you at all. This is just doubling down to say, we're now in our fourth year, our fourth dry season. I get the jitters every time I drive around this hillside, and not just our neighborhood. We have more vegetation than we ever have had in our history. And let me remind the town council members, we were rated a higher risk for wildfire than the town of Paradise before it was destroyed by fire. That's a sobering thought. And so I'm all about urgency. So you have to please forgive me to some degree, because I don't mean to be Paul Revere, riding through the town, but it is something that we have to keep advocating for. We've got to keep pushing. And by the way, we do need to find new sources of revenue. It can't all come from the town coffers, and that type of work is in progress. So I am coming at this, council member, as having met with the Finance Commission, understanding the 700,000 was there from federal funding, but again, just wanted to voice the concern about the fourth dry year and the urgency that we need to demonstrate to our community.
Thank you very much for that explanation.
Let me jump in with one question before I go to the others. You, Mr. Stump, you mentioned not putting density in egress routes and high fire danger zone. Are we planning a density somewhere? I'm not aware that we're doing that. Is that just a general statement, or do you see us considering putting density somewhere that would affect fire egress?
Well, first of all, I understand it's not going to affect those, density considerations that are currently in play do not affect those properties that are in hillside zoning. There will be no change, but there have been proposed changes to density. And what we have to be sensitive to, you take a look at Johnson and Loma Alta Avenues as an example. They are in the very high fire hazard severity zone, and look at the parking issues and the street issues we have now. So if we decided that we would add additional density to those neighborhoods, it's a big mistake to think that. We always have tremendous parking issues. And as you can see, and of course, everybody knows who's parking there on Wednesday afternoon. It's called the high school, right? But Johnson Avenue is a congested street anyway. But the concerns are to make sure that we are not making density decisions without taking a look at evacuation routes that we have, and not compounding the issue, as I said, to create a worst case scenario. If you saw that photo on Johnson Avenue, you see cars parked on both sides, and you see a single truck down the middle of the street. Imagine an emergency. Where is everybody going? It is mass chaos. It would be mass chaos.
Okay. Yeah, I thank you. I think I understand the point. I'll go to Vice Mayor Risto.
Thank you. I have a question either for Mr. Stump or for staff, but regarding weed abatement, I know that, when we do a shaded fuel break, that involves kind of trimming trees and, really big things that take a while to grow back. In terms of weeds, my guess is that that's started over every single year. So when we trim back weeds, is this something that is an annual event on every single street, or is there a certain amount of low weeds that we can tolerate that don't increase our fire danger?
So there's a couple components to that. One is the project we're currently doing, which is town-led, and that's going ahead and trying to do veg management along the roadways within the WUI. Then you have the responsibility on private residents, and that's where we have the county weed abatement program. That does happen annually, and that's what you're used to seeing on your council agendas, where Parks and Public Works comes forward with first the fact that the program is starting, the types of notifications that will happen, and then as you move through the system, folks that are either found to be out of compliance, whether or not they've come into compliance or not. That does happen on an annual basis. And Stephanie Hockmeyer is here tonight. I don't believe they do every property every year, but she can speak to that if she has additional information. And then also there's the program that county fire monitors, where they actually go to individual properties. That project I know is not 100% of properties every year. They go to individual properties, they assess them in terms of defensible space. If they feel that they have remediation they should do, then they do that. So there's kind of the town as a property landowner and a responsible property owner doing what we can do on roadways and on the parks and areas that we control. There's the individual responsibility, which is partially the weed abatement program, and then the individual responsibility about having sufficient defensible space.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Badami.
Thank you. Mr. Stump, thank you for your continued advocacy in this matter. Saving lives is extremely important, and I share your concern. With that, do you see any value in reviving an ad hoc committee to further evaluate the issues you brought up, perhaps to study sources of revenue, grants, further educate the public on the severity of the fourth year of severe drought, the parking and street issues with ingress and egress, and further studies pertaining to an evacuation route? Would you see value in reviving the ad hoc committee?
Pregnant pause, because I've not really given that thought that you've just laid out, some of the things. And so there probably would be some value, but the ad hoc wildfire committee report really laid out a blueprint for moving forward. And I think the key part of that is the follow-up. And I will say that I've continued on, I would say, in kind of my responsibility as the chair of that committee. And Mr. Andrews has been good enough to meet with me monthly, and we literally walk through action items, punch list, and continue to work, collaboratively toward these solutions and move them forward. There's always room for more awareness, and there's tons of that out there. It's really truly getting the public's attention. And that's where I think it's a real challenge, is to get the public's attention, because I still think that our community to a great degree is in denial. They just don't think that wildfire will happen to Los Gatos. And I don't think anybody does until it happens. But I think it's certainly worth reconsidering an ad hoc wildfire committee at the right point in time. I just don't know what that right point is at this moment in time.
Thank you for that. And I would comment that I think some of them are coming out of the denial period with the number of homeowners insurance policies that are canceled and not renewed, and nobody can find coverage. And if they do, it's thousands and thousands of dollars. But thank you for your input.
Very true. Thank you for that.
Spoken like an insurance agent.
Yeah.
But I'm a council member.
Yeah, Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you. And this is maybe a question for staff. And if it isn't the appropriate time for this, but it's directly related to the question and the response that the mayor had about the intensity and densification in our wildfire zones. And I'll put the question out there, and then if staff wants to address this later, but aren't there elements of our WUI wildfire urban interface and are the very high fire hazard zone that are not hillside but are in residential neighborhoods that are currently proposed in the draft general plan for increased density? I may be wrong on that. I just wanted to understand that because I thought it was something beyond just our hillside zone.
Thank you, Councilmember Hudis. Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. You're correct. So our wildland urban interface, the WUI, as you explained, does go beyond our hillside. So that is one component that will be an important factor as council considers the Planning Commission's recommendation at the end of June.
Thank you.
Okay, I think there's no more questions for you, Mr. Stump. Thank you for answering all our questions.
No, thank you.
Next up, Amy Davis.
Good evening, Council. Thank you so much for taking my comment today. I'm just really calling in to thank the Council for continuing rent forgiveness for NUMU in FY23. I'd also like to take the opportunity to plant a seed for our future partnership and the future of our partnership and continue to advocate for NUMU's cultural relevance in Los Gatos, and NUMU being the New Museum Los Gatos, of course. Thank you again for including another year of rent forgiveness. While we're very grateful for this reprieve, it will help us tremendously as we continue to navigate the pandemic. We are, though, set to resume rent payments in July 2023, which will ultimately compromise our efforts to serve Los Gatos with art, history, and culture. We've worked very hard to advocate our value to the town. And as you already know, we support many town strategic priorities in critical ways, especially diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as an institution that is really being viewed as leading the way for equity in Los Gatos, we're naturally a go-to resource for you, and would appeal to you to enlist us as a true partner, which includes financial support for the important work we do. So thank you again for this lifeline. It's a testament to what we can achieve together, absolutely. And we really value our relationship with the town as your tenant and your partner. And we look forward to further conversations about our partnership. So thank you from all of us for your continued support.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. I don't see any hands up. All right. Would anybody else wish to address us on budget items? Catherine Summers.
Good evening, Council. Earlier today, I was in a meeting talking about the town budget, and one of the attendees brought up the movie, Don't Look Up. We all paused, and then he explained. He compared the movie to the town budget in front of you this evening. We cannot afford to have our council members looking in the wrong direction right now. We have to look what is happening right in front of us. And while we may not have a meteor headed our way, we do have some choices to make when it comes to spending. You've heard me say often that the Chamber of Commerce is in a unique position, that we sit at the corner connecting the government, the business community, and the residents. It is the synergy between these three that make for a robust economy and happy people. Because that connection is vitally important, it begs the question, what is really important to our residents and what makes us complete? I think our recreation center, community and adult recreation that is housed there is vitally important. I think our museum is a gift that we cannot take for granted. Our library is, of course, important, as is our visitor and information center. These are the assets that make our community whole. The recent community survey addressed some of these, but did not really ask residents about these in particular. I believe we missed an opportunity there. If we fail to acknowledge that these community assets are important, I think we will fail to thrive. So you ask, where is that money to help offset these costs? I encourage you to look at the $3.7 million in ARPA funding that still exists. Those funds were appropriated for rescue and for innovation and for economic vitality, and of course to shore up budget holes, but they were not really appropriated for the CIP. I think we need to be flexible with those funds. That money is fluid, and we can use it in ways in the next couple of years where it will be needed most. And I think we should look back to our community assets and really put a priority on some of those. Thank you.
Ms. Summers, looks like I have a question from Councilmember Hudis.
Thank you, Ms. Summers. You probably know what's coming, but I'm interested in the transient occupancy tax and the recovery of our business from business travelers and tourists who visit and spend money on hotels and Airbnbs and things like that. In our current budget, we have a very modest recovery. As you know, I say modest as compared to the property tax recovery that we've seen and the sales and use tax that we've seen. Are there measures that we could take to accelerate the recovery of our TOT through destination marketing or other activities that maybe would pay for themselves?
So that is a great question. And you asked me a few weeks back to do a financial analysis actually on the TOT, which is complete. And I think we're meeting later this week and I can go over those numbers with you, and we'll be happy to share with the other council members as well. With regards to the TOT, if you look back in the budget at 2018, our TOT, our hotels were averaging 80% occupancy rate during that time. And we were at about a $2.9 million TOT in TOT revenues. COVID hits. We, obviously didn't have anybody really staying in our hotels. And now we are fighting our way back. We cannot make up some of that lost revenue in what we used to rely on, which was the overflow business travel that came into San Jose. We now have to focus more on the leisure traveler. Perhaps eventually some of that business travel will come back and we will get some of that overflow from San Jose. But I do not think that in the next, and the partners with whom I've spoken at other chambers and at Team San Jose and at other places, they do not believe that the business travel will come back to that extent for at least a couple of more years, if ever. That said, I do think that we have the potential to get back up to about the 1.8 to the $2 million range. But in all of the analysis that I've done, I don't know if we can get above that before the end of 2023 is what I've predicted. Partly because we don't have that many beds. And also because we are challenged right now with the fact that the hotels with whom the chamber used to work in real partnership, I don't have those relationships anymore. No chamber actually here in Los Gatos would have that relationship right now with the hotels because of the management that they have at them. I'm talking about the Hotel Los Gatos and the Toll House in particular. And when you take the rates, the average daily rate that they charged in 2018, 2019, they are nowhere near those rates now. So we don't have the spread of what they are charging in order to collect the TOT on that. Again, I have a chart that I can explain this more. You have so much more to discuss tonight, but it is really it's a fascinating topic and a fascinating study. I will say that for sure the destination marketing that we are doing and where we use some of the $55,000 grant, we use that to build a website and for social media marketing. And those two, I really believe, have paid off. And if we have seen an increase in the TOT to what it is today, we have also seen an increase in the sales tax revenue. And we have also definitely seen an uptick in foot traffic in town. And I think all of those, while we can't take full credit for that through the social media and the destination marketing that we've done, I do think it's helped, as have the promenades, as have some of the other events that we've had. And I think if we continue doing what we're doing and maybe even perfecting it a little bit more, I think we'll get to where we want to be by the end of 2023.
Thank you for your focus on that. And I think this may be something the council may want to come back to. I do think that if the hotels we're projecting revenues that are 30 to 40% lower, even 5 years out, there's a real question about whether they're going to be going concerns or not. So it seems as though we really need to explore this and explore whether there are things we can do to get this on track, because I'm looking at the 5-year forecast and it only gets up to 2 million after 5 years. So it's, it seems as though we'll have a catastrophe before that would happen, with the operators not even being able to, pay for their operating costs. So thank you for that.
Actually, real quick, my hope is that our relationship improves with the management at these hotels. Of course, the Best Western, we have a wonderful relationship with them. I see some, we're making some headway with the other ones. One other area I wanted to point out, though, is with the Airbnb and the VRBOs. We collect less than $10,000 a year in TOT on the Airbnbs and the VRBO. So to your point, Councilmember Hudis, I think there is some work, some incentives, something that we could bring some of those operators, homeowners, VRBO, people who list their homes on VRBO. If we could get them into enlist in our program, I think we could maybe potentially see some more revenues there. So it's another avenue to explore for revenue.
Great. Well, I hope we have an opportunity to explore this in more depth in a future meeting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just follow on a little bit before Councilmember Badami, Ms. Summers. So what I think I'm hearing is our hotels have a decent occupancy. The problem is the dollars per room is well below where it was, and we probably can't push the dollars per room much above kind of the average of our area. So the whole area needs to have more, our greater area needs to have more demand before we could push up the price in our area, in Los Gatos. Is that really what I'm hearing the issue is?
That is mostly correct. However, again, it is the leisure traveler, which is why I'm looking so forward to the summer. We have reasons for leisure travelers to come here this summer, but what you really need is for the Hotel Los Gatos to set the bar at a $450 average daily rate. And then you have the Toll House at a $350 average daily rate. And then, so you have to have some variation. For the last year, we've been at about 50% at best occupancy in all of the hotels and all of the beds. And we've been at about a $200 average daily rate across the board. And so that's where you get that you're not going to be able to make the money that you are in the TOT that you did 4 years ago.
Councilmember Badami?
Thank you. Ms. Summers, with the value in investing in social media being successful, is that more successful in promoting, our events like the promenades that we had, the dining? I'm really concerned about the retail aspect. So do you have any information on how it has helped and benefited the retail segment?
I think that our social media, and again, I have these analytics that I can share at a future meeting or with each of you individually. I believe that the increase in viewers or followers, I should say, on our Instagram and our Facebook, and that's the Visit Los Gatos Facebook and Instagram that I'm talking about. while the events have brought people to town, it is the dining experiences that they're having once they're here, and the vibe that they're getting, and the music that they're listening to, and the hills that they're looking at, that then brings them back again and again and again, which I go back to that uptick in foot traffic. I think that our merchants, the boutiques and whatnot, are struggling for other reasons. Particularly, people will always go out to eat, but right now with inflation where it is, they're not always going to go out to shop. And you can find something that you see in one of our shops, you can find it online. So yes, we have more work to do when it comes to alluring people to town to come and actually shop in our shops. I've been researching ideas of ways to do that, and I think we've landed on some good ideas, but that will, in and of itself, take some more marketing and some creative ideas.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Summers.
All right, looks like no more questions. Thank you, Ms. Summers. I don't see any more hands up from the public to address us, so let's close public comment at this time and come back to council. So let me suggest we start with the Planning Commission recommendations. Would you like to take them one at a time? Councilmember Hudis?
Thank you. I have about 6 questions about the operating budget and a similar number about the capital budget. These seem to be ways of dealing with those issues. So it does seem I would have a hard time voting on these without understanding some of the some of the proposals of the operating and capital budget. I apologize, Mayor, for not getting that to you earlier, but it does seem like the process may be a little challenging.
That's fair enough. Let's go ahead and start with your let me call them general questions.
Thanks. So I had a few on the operating budget, and the first one relates to the gap and to the structural deficit that's been pointed out. So in the transmission letter or transmittal letter, there's some discussion about using one-time funds to fill the operating budget gap. And so my question for staff is, do we anticipate ongoing one-time funds, or is this something that we really need to only look at in maybe years 1 and 2 of the 5-year forecast?
So thank you for the question, Council Member. So you recall I put a slide up that kind of showed the evolution of the current budget years and how as we moved into the close of each year, they actually ended up righting themselves and not needing ARPA funding. So ARPA funding as a consistent eligibility use is for municipalities through 2024, if need be, to use it to continue to write budgets as we continue to watch revenues claw their way back. And so in that regard, if we were to be here next year having a very similar conversation and there were still ARPA funding available, that would be staff's first recommendation to use, consistent with Treasury guidance. Ultimately, as you start to look towards the forecast, consistent deficits is not consistent budgeting, in the sense that ultimately you want to start to show those coming closer together. Marginal deficits or marginal surpluses aren't a concern. Staff has commented that the current deficits in the $2 million range, we don't believe currently are a big concern because of some of the variables I mentioned. What is starting to be concerning to staff is if we continue to see the persistence of deficits year after year in the forecast, if we're here again next year having this same conversation and the year after that, then clearly we have an issue we need to address beyond just utilizing the ARPA funds, which will no longer be available after 2024, are some of the other tools we've used, like status quo budgets. Based on the community survey, at some point, status quo budgets and just maintaining as is service levels will probably not be acceptable to the community. And so at some point, if it continues and if sales tax revenues, don't not only retrace where they were pre-pandemic, but then recapture some of that growth. We just had a great conversation about TOT. One of the reasons staff has the conservative estimate we have is because we don't see much in the way of business travel coming back to our community. I think Director Summers explained it very well, that we're normally spillover from the big conventions in San Jose, and that's just not happening. And so I think over the course of the next year or two, as we continue to see how we retrace coming out of the pandemic, if we continue to see ERAF conversations happening in a similar manner where they say only budget a small amount and every year we capture the entire amount, I think we'll have more clarity as to what we're talking about in terms of the true future deficit profile. But staff is very clear. If we continue to see consistent deficits, that is something that will become a concern to us.
Let me just add that we have been alert to these trends and continue to monitor both revenues and expenditures. And departments did a really thoughtful job this year to try and reduce costs where they could, while also acknowledging some of our own inflationary pressures that we're up against. As noted in the budget documentation, staff has been fairly vocal about needing to have a serious revenue enhancement for 2024. And so we need to continue to position ourselves for the future and recognize, especially now that we have the community survey results, the high expectations of our community to maintain that service level. So we'll have further opportunities to discuss that both with the Finance Commission as well as the Town Council. But I want to just assure the full council that we are alert to these longer term trends and continue to monitor them on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Okay, further questions? Mr. Hudis?
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, I just wanted to get the magnitude of the deficit that we're dealing with on the record. And so I'm looking at Schedule A7, and which is the general fund. And is that correct that the bottom line there is 2.2 million, 2.9, 2.3, 2.5, and 2.6, which I think is a total of 12.5 million. And related to that, Mr. Andrews, in your presentation, you noted that the 5-year forecast was looking at 100% filling of employee slots. What would the fiscal impact be of estimating those costs at our historic average rather than 100%? Is that enough to make up that deficit by itself, or what is the magnitude of that?
Thank you for both questions. In answer to your first question, yes, on page A7, the bracketed numbers that you see at the bottom is the projected cumulative deficit for each one of those years. And so you are correct. Currently, that is how the forecast looks. As I mentioned in my presentation, there are variables and nuances embedded in that, but staff put together the assumptions we put together. And based on those assumptions, you are correct. In terms of the second question, so several years ago, there was a discussion that at the time came out of the Finance Committee and then ultimately was also discussed at the Finance Commission about utilizing a vacancy factor of some type or changing the way we budget FTEs in the budget document. What we ended up doing was taking the recommendation to budget differently. And so we really dialed back the assumptions we used for each budgeted position. And so by doing that, we already saw a reduction in expenses. And so in terms of the magnitude, I'm not sure if Budget Manager Anvari has a sense of what the dollars are that actually equate to the vacancies to see if we can give you some context of what it means. I don't believe it would be on par of 2.2 million or 2.9 million or the other numbers that you referenced. It's a piece of it, and that's why each budget has cured itself each year, but it would not do it in totality. And Budget Manager Angvari, would you like to add anything more to that?
Thank you
Mr.
very
Andrews, let me just make sure it's clear. You said it reduced expenses. It reduced forecasted expenses, not real expenses, just so nobody's confused.
Thank you, Mayor. And that's a great reference point because we have the adopted budget and then we have the forecast. And right now we're talking about a whole host of assumptions in the forecast.
Thank you. Gita Angvari, Finance and Budget Manager. I just want to confirm what Assistant Town Manager Andrews said before about changing our budget methodology. It means that we are budgeting only one step higher of the current position. So it means our budget is lower than used to be. So if we want to go for historical average, this would be a little bit misleading because we use different methodology for the last 2 years. So it's hard to say how much would be our funding in the saving. In the past, it was more usually over $1 million. I would assume it would be less than $1 million, a couple of $100,000. But we won't know those numbers until we close the books and have the ACFR completed.
So based on the current projections, council member, we're probably looking at something potentially 20-30% of the projected deficit could potentially come through salary savings based on what Budget Manager Angvari said.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sack, you took your hand down.
Actually, I think Councilmember Hughes clarified what I was thinking, so I'll wait until he's finished.
Anything? Yep, go ahead, Mr. Andrews.
Sorry, Mayor, I was just going to say, so for instance, this past year, it was a combination of getting the go-ahead to budget more for ERAF. It was a combination of salary savings. It was a combination of TOT performing a couple $100,000 better than staff had projected. And then once again, you know, the fact that departments were asked to try and maintain their budgets from the prior year as opposed to doing anything in the way of significant changes. So it's been, you know, slices of different pieces, whether it's the revenue side, whether it's the expense side, or whether it's the efficiency and the effective management of the department side. And that's what's cured the budgets the last several years.
Go ahead, Councilmember Hudis, with more questions.
Slightly different topic, but related on the operating budget. In the transmittal letter and the explanation about the budget, the staff and the town manager talk about taking action in terms of cost reduction, reducing services, and raising revenue. I have asked the question before, and I would ask again, would staff agree that an additional manner of closing the structural deficit would be to work in a collaborative manner with town personnel to help identify and achieve operational efficiencies that could also have the benefit of improving customer service and the perception of improvement in cycle time, perhaps?
And thank you. And you raised a good point, similar point at the Finance Commission. Throughout each budget year, the town manager directs staff to do that as part of the budget process. But then at the department level, because we're so thinly staffed throughout the organization, we're constantly looking for more efficient ways to do things, because if we can find a more efficient way to do things, it frees up capacity that we can put towards other projects and work of that nature. I believe what you might be referencing is if efficiencies had a strategic monetary target affixed to them, and that is not something we have done to date. What we've done to date is just either departments organically are seeking efficiencies just to increase capacity, or each year the town manager has provided departments with direction that your budget's going to be status quo. And so if you need to augment things in a different fashion, you need to do it because there isn't going to be additional discretionary dollars. In terms of a targeted dollar amount towards an efficiency attainment, that has not occurred yet. But in the transmittal letter, when we use language like we're going to have to, either look at service delivery differences or look at service delivery cuts, that's partially what's inferred in statements like that. That ultimately, if we have to get towards a target, a monetary target, that would be one of the ways we would try to get departments to rethink how they do things to achieve a monetary target.
Great, thank you. And I have some ideas that maybe would be appropriate when we get to the discussion part of the agenda. I think it could help.
Thank you.
Let's go to Councilmember Badami.
I'm just putting it out there, but how do we plan for salary savings continuous over the next 5 years should the proposed draft 2040 general plan be approved with the housing densities, housing growth, and population growth? We would need staff to service that. Any suggestions on that?
So you raise a good point, and we referenced it in the staff report. While we do get residual benefit from salary savings, ultimately the goal would be to have 100% staffing. Our town expects a certain level of service delivery. We want to make sure that we deliver that level of service, and we're currently budgeted already, fairly thin. And so to your point, to continue doing what we're doing, ultimately we would be at 100% staffing, which means we would not accrue salary savings at the end of each year. But the reality is, with turnover and things of that nature, there always appears to be some salary savings. But ideally, we would be a 100% staffed organization delivering 100% of the service that we've committed to the community.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Sayah.
Two questions, thank you. I know, following on Councilmember Hudis's question, I know Monday there was an all-staff meeting that Town Manager Provetti had specifically on the budget. And so I'm curious if there was any, I know many eyes have already seen this, but I'm curious if there was any additional feedback and or suggestions that were shared that perhaps we may not have considered. So that's my first question. And then the second, I know it's a recommendation that we'll discuss later that the Finance Commission had requested on revenue enhancements. And so my question is, isn't this something that we've identified as a strategic priority, and does it require a specific recommendation tonight since it's been something we've already asked for? So those are the two questions.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you for referencing the all-staff meeting that we had yesterday with our town employees. It was a wonderful outdoor gathering and an opportunity for all of the departments to come together and celebrate our many accomplishments and really just be together with all of the COVID restrictions behind us, or at least to the side of us. I did provide an overview of the proposed budget and highlighted the council's strategic priorities, including revenue enhancement. And I did not get any general questions in the group setting. I did get a lot of feedback that was very positive, thanking the town for its continued good efforts to make sure that the staff could do their good work. They're pretty committed to providing good services to our community day in and day out. But we did not, there really wasn't a working forum to be able to dive into specific mechanisms. But please be assured that this is work that we have to continuously look at, just because of how small we are. And we continue to use technological advances. For example, our town clerk recently implemented a technology solution to deal with all of our Public Records Act requests. We continue to look at technology to help us in other ways, so that way staff is really able to do the high value work that a computer algorithm really just can't do. And yes, council member, you are correct. Revenue enhancement has been a strategic priority for the last 2 years. So that's already in the work plan. And in addition, the Finance Commission earlier this calendar year, when it put together its work plan, it did identify interest in examining the major cost drivers for the town's budget. So really both of those items are already in the Finance Commission work plan. And staff is very excited to be able to work with the Finance Commission to continue our work on both of those after the conclusion of the budget cycle.
Okay, no other questions at this time. Mr. Hudis, are you ready to talk about Finance Commission recommendations?
Sure. I think I do have a number of questions about the capital budget that can wait until after we've had that. Thank you. Thank you for accommodating.
Okay. So I guess we would start with questions on these or comments. Is there any one particular people don't like, or they like them all? Any questions on this? Councilmember Sack?
Some specific comments. I guess when I think about the capital, I'm nervous about allocating all 3.7 million of the capital, understanding that there may be a need to dip into ARPA for next year and potentially 2024. So just wanted to share that. But should there be a need to move all of this to general fund, I do want to somehow guide what capital those funds go towards. I think Ms. Summers indicated, you trying to follow the spirit of the intent of community vitality, rescue, innovation. And I know that during COVID, we've all identified the areas that we identified public facilities that we all either used and or wanted. And so I'm just going to throw out a couple things on my list. Public bathroom, that we don't have sufficient public bathrooms and that people were utilizing either the parks, which is fine, but then I think we need to do more enhancement there, or identifying an area where we can create or augment services for the downtown area so that we're not relying on our private businesses. I do think we need to look at how we can, I guess, repurpose our buildings, not only for community space, but also in event of any emergencies. We talked at length about fire prevention, fire safety, and I agree it's a high priority. But beyond, when we think about fire, we also think about lack of services, including electricity. And so solar storage beyond our library, I think we need to start identifying areas of that so that if power goes out, we have additional sources of energy, not only for the town services, but for our residents. And I think of also just areas where we can continue to gather. I know we spent a significant amount of money to invest in parklet and economic vitality, but I also still want to make sure that we think about other areas like community parks. There's the idea of the community garden that never got funded. And so I think you guys get the theme that I'm going here. Like, if we are going to start pushing money towards our capital infrastructure, there are the things that absolutely need to be done, but I also want to start identifying buckets that we think are high priorities that we continue to invest in, so that as we continue to look for sources for capital, at least the town staff is aware of what our priorities are and can start thinking about how we can start to seed those different buckets of money. So I shared that and look forward to hearing what my council members think.
And if I could turn that into a question for Mr. Andrews, So the allocation of the 3.7 million of the ARPA into the GFAR, I wasn't under the impression that it needed to be spent this year. That they just thought it was could be programmed in future years' budgets. Do you feel that that's accurate, or do you think that the idea was to spend an extra 3.7 million this year?
Let me start with the use of ARPA doesn't need to occur until the end of 2024 based on federal guidelines. And then at the commission level, I don't believe they explicitly said in the current year. It was more just finding ways to continue to fund up the CIP program. I don't think they necessarily thought it would be expended in the current year, but they do consistently try to find ways to fund up the CIP program.
And let me follow up on another part of the question for that. So there are some limitations how we can use ARPA dollars, and when we kept it in its own separate ARPA reserve fund, it's clear it only moves out once we've met, the requirements. How are we going to keep track of it if we moved it into the GFAR fund then? In terms, because not any GFAR spending is applicable use, is it?
So, and thank you for the question, and I'm going to do my best not to confuse the conversation, because we talked about ARPA for a very long time in the sense that there were only very specific capital uses that it could be used for: wastewater, sewer, broadband, and things of that nature. When the Treasury came out and adopted their final rule, as opposed to the interim rule, they made the revenue loss eligibility category much broader. And that they basically said that any NEU, which is ourselves, a smaller population, that received less than $10 million, you can just absorb that entire amount under revenue loss. And at that point, it's basically general fund money for any general government purpose. And so that kind of changed the conversation we've had for a while, whereas it could be used for virtually any purpose. Now, that being said, to Councilmember Sayak's point, the entire program was initiated for some very higher purpose goals. And so just because administratively they've made it easier, which they have, it doesn't necessarily change those high-level initial goals of the intent of the whole program. So I hope that didn't confuse things too much. Administratively, we're not necessarily held to a standard where certain uses would be deemed no longer eligible. From the intent of the program, I would concur with Councilmember Sayak that it still has some high-level goals the entire federal program was trying to achieve.
And I see Councilmember Sayak raised her hand, so let me go back to you. I'm sure you're following on to this.
I am, and thank you for reminding me. One of the earlier questions I had for the town staff was broadband. And are we aware of any areas of our community that is lacking broadband? And so, because I know that was a concern.
Correct. And they're talking about, digital deserts. It's my understanding that Los Gatos is not a digital desert in the sense they're talking about. That being said, we know we have pockets in town that probably have poor receptivity, but I don't know if it's attributable to some type of economic dislocation and therefore they're not receiving proper. I think it has more to do with our hillsides, but I will gladly welcome anybody from Public Works or any of our other departments who feels they might want to speak to this. But I do think that they were talking about areas where clearly there had been kind of an economic element to the fact that there were digital deserts in geographic areas.
Looks like Mr. Baker wants to add something. Let's go with him.
Hello, Council. The library does lend out Wi-Fi, high-speed Wi-Fi to anybody that would like to use it, and that is through a federal grant program that was funded through ARPA. Those monies don't come through the town; those come from the state library, and we're a recipient of that. So we do have multiple devices that can go out to anybody in the community that needs connectivity.
Thank you. And for future use for revenue loss in future year budget, is that correct?
I believe that's correct, but I'm going to want confirmation from a budget manager on Vari or Director Conway.
Well, thank you. I can start answering. So the staff will, regardless what's the direction from the Treasury, how we can receive the fund and how we can do the accounting for the fund, we are still going to follow every dollar of the ARPA money with the council direction. So we will make all the accounting changes and reserve to make sure that funds are spent away. So if we move it to the GFAR fund, we will reserve it under ARPA in GFAR fund. So we will make all of that tracking mechanism.
And if I could add to the mayor's question, if in future council meetings, we find that we actually need ARPA for another purpose, the council could adopt another resolution to make those changes. So you do have the discretion of making future changes in terms of your allocation of ARPA.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to Vice Mayor Risto now.
Thank you. First of all, I really like the capital ideas that Councilmember Sayak brought up. But going back to the I thought we were just, so I'm thinking about the recommendations from the Finance Commission, and I do have some concern about taking all the rest. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andrews. I have concern about taking all the rest of our ARPA money and at least saying that we're going to use it all for capital budgeting purposes, because we have not used our prior ARPA money for capital projects. We've used it for economic vitality. We've used it to assist with services. And I don't really want to be locked into something right now. I think if we want to take some of it for capital, but I think an assumption that we want to keep a certain percentage of the budget or a certain percentage of money always allocated for capital is not necessarily borne out by, our survey or what we've been doing. I think looking at the community survey that we reviewed at our last meeting, we are hearing from people that, well above the average for the nation, people are very happy with Los Gatos. They're very happy with the life there. They're very happy with the services. And I would be hesitant to potentially, at the risk of providing services in the future, locking things into capital. So, I realize that we can move things around in the future, but I would not be inclined to right now say, let's take all of the 3.7 million of the unallocated ARPA for CIP. The other thing that gives me a little bit of heartburn is the consideration of dissolution of the workers' compensation and self-insurance internal service funds. I feel like the idea that we have the opportunity as things come up, if it's planned for and we've got this fund, we can smooth things out. The thought that that money would be dissolved, and then if something comes up, all of a sudden we've got to take the money from another part of the budget is a little bit, it just seems too risky. It's almost like we're self-insuring or something. I don't know. That part I'm not comfortable with. I know that the staff gave pros and cons, but I would appreciate more of an explanation of the downside of doing that if that's possible, because that one makes me really, it just feels like we would, when something comes up, we feel more on the edge of catastrophe, because all of a sudden it's like, now we have to come up with the money to cover a workers' comp case or something. So if you could expand on that, Mr. Andrews.
Sure. And so as you mentioned, we laid out the pros and cons. Currently, the way we administer, and we do administer through internal service funds. That being said, it is also an appropriate alternative to administer it through the general fund. The primary difference, I believe you actually already hit on, which is if we charge departments a certain rate each year and we start to accumulate a reserve, that reserve kind of works as a cushion to soften years when we might have an unexpected claim. And so it's a way of smoothing out what otherwise could be a lumpy experience. If we move to the general fund, then to your point, it means that when an experience occurs, it'll be an experience for that year. And unless there's another reserve mechanism created, it would be monies that would need to be found through the existing budget to make sure that we pay for that occurrence. And so they're both appropriate ways. We just want council to be aware that the one way, while you might have monies accruing that you could have access to for other purposes, and to a certain extent that could be viewed as idle funds, are being reserved there so that you can have a smoother experience throughout the years. If you remove the internal service funds, and if you don't create another type of reserve mechanism, either in the town attorney's office or through a contingency in the town attorney's, it does mean as an experience occurs, you will realize that experience in that year. And if you've already not budgeted for it, then we would have to do some type of a budget adjustment to make sure that we can pay for that experience.
Okay, thank you. If I could continue on, Mayor. So, I mean, this is my understanding that this is typical of municipalities. This is not an unusual funding approach.
So, yes. So I don't want to use a blanket statement because I know the Finance Commission has some strong feelings, and I don't want to give the impression that, we're trying to counter what they're saying. But municipalities often, and I would almost say predominantly, use internal service funds, whether or not they use as many as the town uses, which I think has been one of the arguments at the Finance Commission, that perhaps we have too many internal service funds, and collectively it's resulted in, an aggregate amount of idle funds each year. But especially in risk areas like workers' comp and self-insurance, it is not unusual to have internal service funds. Now, that being said, it's not unusual to also run it through the general fund. We had a conversation today with our new town attorney, the city of San Mateo. That's how they did it. So it's not uncommon to have internal service funds, but that doesn't mean it's not uncommon to also run it through the general fund. And it looks like town attorney Whalen has turned her camera on.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents would be, we just want to make sure that we have a cushion of money available in case we get a large claim. And so whatever we can do to make sure that the money is available. And then I did notice that if the council were to recommend this change, we would implement it in June of next year. And I think that would give me an opportunity to talk to our insurer to make sure that, this is the path that they would recommend as well.
Okay, thank you. So then I guess if we did not continue with this fund, we would have to create another one, it sounds like.
Potentially. So to date, the way we do it is we charge departments and those charges accrue. If we were to just create a contingency somewhere, which would in essence be a reserve, we would just budget the way we budget some of our other reserves. It would just be a dollar amount, whether 250 is an appropriate amount, 500,000 is appropriate amount. That'll depend on the experience we've had and what the forecast of future experience could be from, like, for instance, our workers' comp consultant and things of that nature. Staff, is not necessarily saying you can't go the route of the recommendation of the Finance Commission, but as you just heard, town attorney, there's probably still a rationale for having some type of a reserve mechanism, in the event that you do start to have unexpected and, potentially high experiences.
Okay, thank you. Then I think, my comment would be, if we want to consider this, I would want to wait another year and find out what would have to be put in place before we eliminated these service funds.
And the staff report did say that we would ask if council decides that this is an action they want to take. That is the one request we did make, is that you give us a little time to do it administratively on the accounting side. there's a little bit of work that needs to be done for them to unravel this program. A couple of years ago, when we removed general fund salaries out of internal service funds and brought them back into the general funds, it is quite a bit of accountancy that has to happen to make sure it's done correctly. And then, as you just heard the town attorney speak, she would also like to do her due diligence with the existing provider to see, you know, if they would have any recommendations about, you know, putting something like this into effect.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I guess following up, Mayor, on my first point, I'm all about infrastructure and capital improvements, but I want to make sure that we're not locking ourselves in and not being able to provide the services that our community members value very highly. I do know that our Parks and Public Works and our grant writer have been extraordinarily successful at leveraging the money that we put toward capital with grants. We have other opportunities to bring money in. We're not going to be able to bring grants in to pay salaries. So I just want to make sure that we're not pushing more toward infrastructure than the services that our community members expect. So I'm not at all interested in moving all of the remaining ARPA money into the CIP. Thank you.
And I, as a member of the Finance Commission, I think you're reading that correctly. Finance Commission is recommending that it all go into the CIP so that we think about using it for CIP and not other things. And as you said, you don't have to agree with that, but that is basically the recommendation by recommending that it moves there so that we're thinking of it as for capital and not other things. Let's go with Councilmember Hudes next.
Thank you. And I've paid close attention to the Finance Commission deliberating on both of these items. And with regard to ARPA for capital, the thing we need to keep in mind is that we do not have a systematic way of funding capital in town. Historically, the only way capital has been funded is by looking at the leftover operating expense and saying, okay, we have something left over this year, therefore we can fund capital. And that over a period of time leads to degradation of our streets, of our infrastructure, of our sewer system, and eventually the liquidation of the assets of the town. So one of the things that the Finance Commission has been working on for some time, and I would certainly respect their thoughts on this, is how do we systematically program something for capital? And we took a part of Measure G fund last year, but it's a very modest amount. And now this is another step forward. And that's really the difference between, leaving something aside is that while on the operating budget, we have very predictable sources of sales tax and et cetera that fund our general fund and our operating expenses. But we have not historically had that for capital. And when times were great, okay, we were able to do it. But we are, as town staff has pointed out, facing some budget deficits in the future. And we have to be particularly careful about this. And that's why I believe the Finance Commission recommended that we find more sources this year. Now, I would like to see us go further and develop a long-term capital plan that says over time, not just that we have 75 million of unfunded, but what do we really need to fund in the different categories that are important to the town? As Councilmember Sayoc was talking about, there are maintenance items, but there's also things that contribute to the quality of life of our residents, and to look at our capital program in those categories as a portfolio of spending, that we cover some of those type of things, such as the bathroom situation and other things like that. The Finance Commission wasn't ready to take on that fully. I do think that it's something that they, as professionals, could help us with, and that is coming up with a long-term plan for not only expending capital, but also funding capital, so that we can do this. But the ARPA was a step toward that. If I might comment on the internal service funds, again, this has been a long-standing area of the Finance Commission's concern, and the concern that we have too many ISFs, that we should be using reserves in our general fund for that type of purpose, and that there are a lot of reasons and a lot of municipalities that do things that way. I don't know that staff has systematically looked at other municipalities and presented that, but it went through pretty quickly at the Finance Commission. And so I would certainly support the town attorney looking into this as well, and maybe not acting immediately on it, but I still think it's a very good recommendation from the Finance Commission.
Let's go to Councilmember Sayak next.
Thank you. With regard to the Internal Service Fund, I know a couple of years ago, Mayor Rennie, you may remember, we actually started to look at the different, I call them buckets. I don't know what they're actually called. So forgive me, Mr. Andrews, but we looked at the different buckets to see what could basically be collapsed and help better redistribute the money. The question I have, and I know we spent some time looking at this, so if you could help remind me again, Mr. Andrews, how this works. You mentioned we charge departments for a lot of this. If we were to collapse the workers' comp, would all those costs be reflected in each department instead of just one account for all staff? Is that like, I'm trying to figure out the pros and cons of what this would look like in the future.
So let me go ahead and start with kind of your mechanical question. So currently what we do is we try to project what we think we may need in terms of revenue for that year. And then we also run forecasts, like for instance, on equipment replacement, we're also looking at a forecast of what we think our needs will be in future years. Then the finance department comes up with what they think is a reasonable charge to that department. And then they also try to come up with what might be a reasonable pro rata apportionment per each department. So for instance, workers' comp claims tend to happen predominantly in areas where there's physical activity. We have certain departments where they have more physical activity. And so some of the charges in internal service funds are proportional to that department. Others are across the board for all departments because it's perceived that almost everybody is utilizing that service equally. If we were to stop doing it, the department would no longer have that charge. So from the department's perspective, it's an expense that goes away. Now, that being said, if we move to the new model, we're still going to have to find out a way to fund claims or to fund, an event when it happens. And that's yet to be determined. If a claim emanates out of a particular department, should that department's budget be responsible in its entirety in that year? And that's part of what will still need to be addressed in the coming year if council decides to move forward with this recommendation. That's one of the reasons we asked for a little time, because we do have to work out those type of mechanical details, because the same way we're trying to apprise council that if you do this, which is done in communities, you just need to understand the lumpy nature of what could occur. And so that would also be true for departments. If we move down this path and we decide that, a department should be solely responsible for events, or if we think that that department is part of a larger organization and therefore they should be insulated because they're just one piece of a broader institution, then we could probably work out some type of proportional share. But that is one of the mechanics that'll need to be worked out. And I do not see either the budget manager or the finance director turning their cameras on. So I believe I have answered your question.
Now you've got the budget manager, so let's go ahead with.
Thank you. I raised my hand. So that just in addition of the claims activity, the other big expense in those programs is the insurance premium, which is a couple of $100,000. So that would be distributed within the department. And this is the mechanism that we have to research what the best way to do it.
Thank you.
And our finance director wants to add in, it looks like.
Yes, hi, this is Steve Conway, Director of Finance. I was just going to comment that the chief difference that I have tried to communicate about this issue is that right now, when we have an internal service fund, when we do have, as the budget manager pointed out, amounts that we've set aside for claims that we know of that we expect to be paying off in future years over a certain period of time, we've established liabilities and cash in the fund to pay those off over time. We have money set aside for that. If we do move it into the general fund, as Councilmember Hudis pointed out, we could have a reserve in the general fund that would be the same type of mechanism. The problem with that, in my view, is that the reserves in general fund are not considered liabilities. So that's flexible and a future council could use it for something else. So you lose some of that protection that you have when you have it set aside in an internal service fund. But I think staff has said, you know, we can do it either way. And as long as if you did have it in reserve in the general fund, you'd probably you'd need to revise your reserve policy to make sure that future councils didn't degrade those reserves, so that you would still have that money set aside for those liabilities that we do at year end. We have to accrue a liability right now in our internal service fund for any of our estimated claims for the future, and those are set up. If it moves to the general fund, of course, we'll have an issue there that there'll be a reserve, and we just want to make sure that reserve would be somewhat untouchable, so that you would still have, otherwise the lumpiness and having to find money somewhere else would be a problem.
Let me follow on with the Director Conway. So it's a little bit of a complicated discussion in Finance Commission, so I can't say that I'm completely an expert, but I wonder if there isn't a middle ground somewhere. I think one of the concerns of the Finance Commission was you have a fund where we weren't really controlling how much money was in it. At one point, there was almost $2 million, then there was almost nothing. And would a middle ground be to create a policy instead that more tightly controlled how much money we allowed in that fund? So as it's been called there, the cookie jar is less full and less egregious, shall I say?
Yes. One of the issues we have in those funds is that we do try to set a rate and the user charges that we make to the departments for the risks that they're taking in delivering services. We try to set a user rate. In certain years, I would say we're fortunate and we don't get a big workers' comp claim or a big liability claim against the town. So we end up with some excess dollars in those funds, which then provides some cushion or some surplus available for the years when you're going to have some adverse experience. One of the problems that, the years I've been here, it's a very, there's a lot of volatility in risk management. Some years you just like when we have a car accident, you never know when you might have a fender bender, but they're pretty infrequent, you hope, but and then they tend to, so it's hard to predict. The one thing we can do with workers' comp, though, is we can definitely, if we can get with the third-party administrator, some pretty good handle on what we think will be our future, like 2 to 3 years out. I think we can really try to tighten that one down. General liability is a little tougher because those are usually, very unpredictable, unfortunately. But we've always, in the years I've been here, I think we've hovered anywhere from $1 to $2 to $2.5 million in some of those funds. And as pointed out in the Finance Commission, it looks like as next year's budget, we're going to be taking those fund balances down pretty significantly. So that means we've had some adverse experience in recent years. That's really what that means. We would either have to adjust our premiums going forward, or so that we would not see our fund balances decrease, or look for other ways to save money in those risks. We can look for ways to save on insurance premiums, and there's a lot of areas we can look at. But I think as staff, we are totally flexible. We can definitely do it in the general fund. It just would take some accounting work to get it all set up. And so we're not, wedded to internal service funds. It's just been a good tool for us. And, I have felt that it's served its purpose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me go to Councilmember Badami now.
Thank you. I'm going to provide my input on the recommendations of the Finance Commission, because in the end, we're going to need to make motions and get majority votes or maybe not majority votes. But I do want to say hats off to the Finance Commission for their focused and very thorough evaluations. I listened to most of the meetings and I appreciate all the hard work that they put into this. I too, along with the Vice Mayor and Councilmember Sayak, have reservations about exhausting all the ARPA funds. Perhaps just like maybe the middle ground with the other funds that the mayor just brought up, we could find some middle ground with the money, not necessarily the 3.7 that they were recommending, but maybe, 2 million, maybe 1.5, something. We're going to need to do something to get a motion passed on that. As far as the capital programs, I'm looking at complementing our strategic priorities as well. And I've brought up a public restroom before during a council meeting. I think it's of high importance. I work in the downtown. It's been brought to my attention by adjacent businesses next to mine. I've been approached by people looking for a bathroom, and I don't think it's very fair to our businesses to accommodate and do the janitorial service where really the town should be doing that, especially if we want to promote destination, marketing and have everybody come to town and frequent our community placemaking areas and retail, etc. I'm big on the community vitality and the repurposing of buildings in the event of a catastrophe and emergency, especially with fire evacuations, resonates quite highly for me. That internal service funds, I'm on the fence on that. I would really like to get more information on that. And I would have confidence in our new town attorney looking into it for us and advising us accordingly.
All right, thank you. That was a great summary. I'll just add that, staff will be bringing forward in the future a more full discussion about capital programs. So we don't actually need to discuss that fully here, but I'm sure they're happy to take our inputs as we're giving them. So I would also say, a bathroom in the downtown is a good idea. I think the chamber's been actually acting as the chamber pot. So maybe we can come up with a better solution. And as you said, other businesses, and obviously more for fire prevention is a good idea. I do have a question for staff on that. Since we have 700,000 now, can we get more done in a year? In other words, are there limitations by how much work can be done in 1 year, whether we have enough staff to do it, whether the companies we've hired can do much more? It seems like it's been a pretty big job to get $500,000 worth done. So can you give us some input on that?
So I'll get started, and then if interim director would like to also jump in, or anybody else from Parks and Public Works. So what we've seen the last several years since we started the program is, because we have not done this, I'm going to say literally in decades, we've had a trimming cycle that is a fairly long cycle. So we've never tried to do a mass veg management of 31 miles of the WUI. So what we have found is two things. One, for $500,000, you get approximately 4 to 5 miles done, because it is so invasive and it requires an extensive amount of vegetation management. The first year, we also included eucalyptus trees, and that took an exorbitant amount of time and an exorbitant amount of the budget. And so the second year, they just kind of limbed eucalyptus and were no longer taking them down unless it was deemed appropriate to take an entire eucalyptus tree down. So with 700,000 in federal funding, we were thinking this is pretty consistent to what we've done the last 2 years. I do know that in the past, Director Morley thought that the tree crews liked being in there more kind of around the winter months. I also think there was an element of ecological species that it was less disruptive at the time. And so it was cooler weather for the crews because it's a very manual intensive job. So typically he would start the program, I want to say in the November, December timeframe, and then it would conclude, sometime around the March timeframe. So if we continue with those types of parameters, then 700,000 will get us another probably 6 miles, which should conclude most of the priority 1 and priority 2 mileage. And so I think it's sufficient doing what we've been doing. That being said, if we wanted to try and get more done, I'm sure we could either ask the current vendor to, scale up if they have the capacity, or we could hire a second vendor and have 2 crews out there. But I will say veg management has become a very popular endeavor throughout the state. And so these crews are competitive to get. And so we would have to see. I will say, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but I do want to remind the council that starting, I want to say almost 3 years ago, Parks and Public Works started a grant application with FEMA that had 2 components to it. One was $1.5 million towards the roadway vegetation management program we're talking about. And then another component of it was $2 million to do veg management on our own properties, the parks we own where we thought we needed to be a better land steward. The first component of that, based on interactions that Parks and Public Works has had with FEMA, it appears as if we are in the final stages of most likely being awarded those funds in the foreseeable future. So there is the potential of another $1.5 million coming into the program. I don't want to put the cart before the horse because working with FEMA is a long endeavor, but Parks and Public Works have had meetings with them lately, including a field on the ground meeting that gives the impression that it's very close. And I do see Interim Director Borden's hand up. It looks like he'd like to speak to the item also.
And let me add to the question. I think that our vendor has been outsourcing some of it to some of the other companies also. And so maybe they can scale up with outsourcing. Go ahead.
Yeah, Tim Borton, Interim Director of Parks and Public Works. Yeah, and I everything that Arn said about the 1.5 million is accurate. We've been told just as of I believe last week that we should anticipate an answer on that FEMA money in about 3 months.
Okay. Councilmember Hudes, let's go to you.
Thank you. And Mayor, I assume that the other points in the staff report about approving the budget might lend themselves towards specific capital or operating items, but I would be prepared to make a motion on all 4 or one at a time, whatever you prefer, on the Finance Commission recommendations at this time.
I will leave that up to you, what you'd like to do. You heard people's preferences, so if you think you can incorporate them in all 4 all at once, or do them separately, I'll leave that up to you. Of course, if we can't get an all-encompassing one passed, then we can go back to one at a time.
Okay, I'd be willing to try in all 4 first and then see where we get. So the first, I move to approve the Finance Commission recommendation of allocation of 3.77 million to the general fund appropriated reserve with the other information that's included in the staff report. I would move to approve 2.2 million of unallocated ARPA funds to the GFAR for capital budgeting purposes. And happy to explain my thinking on that particular number. Mostly it's because we have already taken off the top 1 million of ARPA to cover operating. And I am encouraged and hopeful that we may be able to return that to as we did last year and not use that. And that would give us a balance of 2.5 million for next year. Then with regard to the dissolution of the workers' comp and self-insurance internal service funds, I would recommend that we defer this for a report at our midterm budget with the opportunity for our town attorney to provide some input and for us to look carefully at other communities. And then with regard to the work that's been proposed by the Finance Commission, that we acknowledge their finding, and we ask the commission to work with town management to confirm the actual amount of the deficit and come back with suggestions and ideas on how we can fix the structural deficit. And I would add two other things. Well, I would add one other thing to that, and that would be to include, let me get the wording of it here. Sorry. To initiate, for the town to initiate an employee-led operational efficiency improvement program in order to measure key processes and establish a goal of 3 to 5% operational improvements in FY22 and to develop 5-year goals beyond that. So I think that would be beyond just looking for the commission to make recommendations about revenue enhancement and cutting services or costs, but to actually initiate such a program that would be outside of the work of the Finance Commission. So that's the motion, and happy to discuss or take it apart in pieces.
Could you just clarify one thing for me? You said an employee-led operational efficiency targeting 3 to 5%. And then you said develop 5-year goals, but you mentioned commission, so I got confused in there.
So I wanted to be clear that that was not part of the Finance Commission making recommendations to the town. Rather, this is the town employees who I think are excellent and have great ideas about improvement, actually working in a team manner to come up with recommendations that could result in that. So I was differentiating in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Councilmember Badami, are you interested in a second or ask questions or?
I'm going to second the motion.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. I would like to ask a question. So just so we're clear, if we move the 3.77 to capital programs, does that create a budget deficit we now have to fill for the coming year?
So currently, the way we're budgeted, it would create a deficit of about 700,000. And so instead of the estimated deficit of about 1 million, we would now have an estimated deficit of about 1.7. If the council were to ask staff how to cure that, we would probably default to ARPA once again. And so instead of a million in ARPA, we would, from a staff perspective, we would recommend 1.7 million.
Okay, Vice Mayor Risto?
Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna, Councilmember Badami still had her hand up. I want to make sure there was nothing else. Go ahead, Vice Mayor Risto.
All right, thank you. I can support 2 of those. In term, the first item, the second item, the 2.2 million of ARPA money, I would be more inclined to be closer to 1 million, especially because in the next couple of months, we may hear if we're getting the 1.5 million FEMA money. I just don't want to be overcommitting our upper money right now. So I won't be able to support this motion if it stays at 2.2 million. The other thing is, I think I'm not saying that they're wrong, but there are a lot of assumptions in the last part in item 4 in terms of a potential structural financial deficit. I don't know what's going to come forward in terms of revenue in the future, how things will develop out, what kind of housing we might have, if that will add to the services we need, or if it'll provide more tax revenue. And so I think an assumption that our employees can come up with a certain amount of cutbacks when we know that we've been operating at a status quo budget, trying to provide services with understaffed departments in some cases, and continuing to move forward. I don't really want to set a target that I don't even know if it can be reached. So I could support items 1 and 3. I like the idea of deferring until we can get more information about the internal service, but I cannot support items 2 and 4.
Okay, Councilmember Hudes, you would like to
I just wanted to, sure. I just wanted to clarify what is generally meant by operational improvements. It doesn't mean cutting necessarily, and it generally means teams working together to identify quality, costs, or cycle time improvements, and those of about 3 to 5%. So it's not a dollar cut that the teams need to come up with, but it would be a start toward measuring some of our processes and leading toward operational improvements. I know that we ask staff for their ideas on a periodic basis, but this would be step further than that in terms of working in teams to look at the processes, look at the inefficiencies. I know I hear from residents all the time about, while an individual department is very efficient, the handoff between one department and another causes a lot of delays. So there could be benefits not only for our town and our budget, but also for our residents if we have a more traditional, systematic way of teams working together to find efficiencies. And so that's what I meant by operational efficiencies.
Vice Mayor Risto, you wanted to add?
Yeah, Mayor, if I may, I'd like to just ask our town manager and assistant town manager, I mean, knowing that each year with our budget for a few years, we've asked our departments to retain a status quo budget. Can you explain to me, I mean, I thought our departments were already working on ways to, with limited resources, continue to provide high levels of service. So is what Councilmember Hudes asking for materially different than what's already occurring, or what is occurring right now as we've moved forward for the last couple of years?
So I'll start, and I'll be happy to have other directors talk about their specific experiences with their teams. These last couple of years, we have had status quo budgets. And what that effectively means is that our costs continue to rise, but the budget for the department can't rise. So by necessity, we've had to find those efficiencies. And sometimes that means moving money from one line item to another, maybe not investing in certain aspects of our services to the same extent that we have in the past, in order to make sure that we have resources for the high value, high demand services. The type of quality improvement process that Councilmember Hudes is mentioning is very common. It's something that typically happens in larger organizations when you're going through a major change of a technology improvement. I imagine that as we implement our new financial and HR system, we'll be doing a fair amount of this kind of QCM work. anyway, just because it will, the program itself will force us to think about how we input data, how many times we have to repeatedly input data, and how we can improve efficiencies in that way. I think the 3 to 5% target it's helpful to know what the council member has in mind in terms of a target. But if you look at the metrics of cycle time, customer satisfaction, quality, et cetera, quality in particular, it's very hard to measure, when we would actually, how would you know that you've got actually a 5% improvement in quality when already we have such high customer satisfaction rates? I mean, I think clearly the permitting process, handoffs between Parks and Public Works and community development, the development review process is always ripe for process improvements. And I applaud Director Paulson and our building official for already looking at our processes to see how we could create expedited processes, particularly for our business community that is facing, very high inflationary pressures, and really time really is money in that respect. But I think, again, we're working in kind of a low resource area. So having the staff time to devote to employee-led teams is going to be a trade-off, because the staff is so busy doing the work and providing that high level of customer touch to each resident, that it may be a struggle. And again, like so many strategic priorities and high level work, it will likely fall on the directors and the upper management team to really take the lion's share of this work. And I'll open it up because I know Tim, when Tim and I worked together in San Jose, we did a lot of QTM work in San Jose. It was really part of the culture, and it led to the performance measures. Los Gatos has had performance measures for years, and we do use that as a way of guiding our services. There's always room for improvement, and we're happy to do it. I just don't know if we're going to achieve the 3 to 5% efficiencies. And I'm not sure how much that's going to translate into cost savings. But I welcome others to jump in.
Mr. Paulson looks interested.
Yes, thank you. So along those lines, actually the building official is working with our permit vendor to create some more tables and query information so that we can dive a little bit deeper into our timing, for instance. So we are in the middle of creating some of those opportunities where we can get reports that measure far more specific things than we have measured before. For instance, it's the, how much time is it in the town's hands? How much time is it in the applicant's hands? How much, what are the level of comments that are necessary? What kind of plans to the quality issue of plans that we're getting? And so those are things that we're going to be able to measure down to the department. So whether that's fire, planning, building, and also Parks and Public Works. So we are working on some of those things. But, we're, again, as Ms. Pravetti mentioned, we're always looking for efficiencies in all of our processes. And so we'll also, I think it's a good point, kind of that cross-departmental, whether that's with Mr. Borden or whoever the future Parks and Public Works Director is, kind of sitting down, having that conversation as well. What can we do, with our different locations to make sure that we are making that communication happen and hopefully providing the most efficient processes we can.
Yeah, and it's efficiency of our staff, but also efficiency of our customers using us too. Then, because you're kind of talking about both things there. Looks like Mr. Baker wants to add in, so let's have him.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that our departments don't work in isolation. We're a small team here in the town, and we're always in constant dialogue between departments. We're very aware of when things are not working efficiently, and we get together in meetings between directors and individual staff members, who process different things or process invoices or do whatever happens in the chain in order to try to figure out ways that benefits us in mutual departments in terms of moving things faster through, because we're aware that we need to move as fast as we possible as in a tiny team that we are. And so this dialogue is just constant and it's ongoing. And I would say that if we take into account really the rising costs, and we have all the inflation going on right now, but costs have been rising in everything we do over the past many, many years. And we've always kept a status quo budget. And if we take into account that we're keeping a status quo budget, even though costs are rising, I would venture to say that we're hitting the target already if you take into account the fact that those costs are going up or inflation is going up. So that's where I would be coming from. This is a small town. It's a small staff. What we provide in terms of the amount of staffing that we have, I think is, we're working a lot of our staff to the bone. And we're always looking for ways to become more efficient. And trying to cut back even farther from that is, I think, is going to be a hard blow to some staff. I think that it's already really working as hard as they can, and that's all I have to say.
Councilmember Hudes, you wanted to add in again?
Yes, thank you. The structural deficit is the deficit, and it is something that we need to face, and it is something different than what we've had in the last few years. When the ARPA funding goes away, there will be a couple of choices. One is to get a new tax through. The other would be to cut services and to cut staff. And that would be sort of a top-down decision that would be made by the town manager and by the council. What I'm suggesting is that we have more of a bottoms-up effort that's systematic, that involves the ideas of our employees, and this is, I said, an employee-led program, to work at the same time to generate ideas, and to do that in maybe a little bit more systematic way than we've done in the past, with a little bit more specific goal. And for that team to come up with the 5-year goal as well. This works well in small and large organizations, but it is the alternative to cuts that could be coming in order to close the deficit. We cannot operate in the negative, and it would, I think, be better to involve our employees in a systematic manner to help. And so that's sort of my last word on that. And hopefully we can find a way out of this situation, but I'd like to do it in a way that involves our employees rather than it being done to them through cuts as other municipalities have had to do.
Vice Mayor Risto?
Yeah, no, I feel like the Finance Commission has done a good job. They're coming primarily from the private sector. They are not government employees. They sometimes, I think, may not realize how much we are completely a service industry. I think whether we have a structural deficit or not, having a lack of, a concern about a budget is not a new thing at all in Los Gatos or for other municipalities. I mean, during the recession, there were huge adjustments that had to be made, and town staffing has never quite recovered to the levels it was before that. Councils before us increased TOT and added to a sales tax, and it is one of our council priorities to look at enhanced revenue, other options for revenue, and we have a few things that we're looking at. And so I think this is an ongoing issue. We have to provide service. This is what we do, and we have to think about the best ways to do that and how to fund it. So, I think we all agree we have amazing employees. They're working really hard. We need to maintain the levels of service that we've got, and we want to continue to fund our capital improvements. It's just a question of where do we put that burden? And, for that reason, I'm not going to be able to support item number 4.
So to be clear, there's kind of an item number 4 and 5, right? Mr. Hudis, number 4 is for the planning commission to work with staff. And number 5 is the employee initiated efficiency.
Correct. That's
Yeah, okay.
the Finance Commission and the employee-led program.
Okay. Councilmember Badami, you wanted to?
Yes, I was just going to make the correction that it wasn't the Planning Commission, that it was the Finance Commission.
I'm sorry, I don't know why I keep saying that.
but I think Councilmember Hudis made that clear. I know it's getting late and we've been reviewing a lot. I don't know how the rest of the votes are going to go because you've got the maker of the motion, you have a second, and we already know that Vice Mayor Risto is not going to support it. So I'd like to see where this goes. And then we could try some other motions to start moving this forward.
Okay, let me call the question then. We'll start with Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
Councilmember Hudis.
Aye.
Councilmember Risto, or Vice Mayor Risto.
No. Councilmember
Saab.
No.
Oh, now you're leaving it up to me to decide, huh? I'm going to vote yes on this. So the motion passes 3-2.
And now we will need a cure for the extra $700,000 of deficit.
Right. So to the town manager's comment. So now let's focus on the broader picture. You can see that this is an opportunity if the council wants to provide comments on the assumptions in the 5-year forecast. Now that we know the outcome of the Finance Commission, we will need direction to balance the 22-23 proposed budget beyond the $1 million that staff had already recommended for what the estimated deficit was. It's an opportunity to provide any other direction on the proposed operating budget, along with the capital budget. And then finally, administratively, let's not forget to make a motion for the 22-23 list of donations.
Okay, so Councilmember, would you like a break since it's already 9:30? Let's see, I can't see my clock. Looks like 9:36. So do you want to go come back at 9:45? Okay, so let's take a break till 9:45. order. Should we start with, maybe the first one's really easy. Does anybody want to change anything in the 5-year forecast assumptions? Doesn't look like it. Good. Councilmember Badami.
Well, I'm going to make a motion, since nobody wants to change anything, that we accept the 5-year forecast, and with the good news that we can pave our roads for the next 5 years.
Councilmember Hudis.
Second.
Okay, I'll go ahead and call the question. Councilmember Hudis.
Aye.
Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
Councilmember Sack.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Aye.
Mayor votes aye. One item done unanimously. Next, for direction for balancing the budget, I think Mr. Andrews wanted to tee that up for us.
Correct. So in the budget that was presented on the 18th and this evening, there's an estimated deficit for fiscal year 22-23 of approximately 1 million. The staff recommendation was to use the 1 million. The recommendation that came out of the Finance Commission that was discussed earlier purposely left that alone. And so with the action you did take, though, from the Finance Commission, we believe we currently have an additional 700,000 deficit that now needs to be balanced. Staff's recommendation will be consistent with the budget that we proposed on the 18th, which would be to use ARPA funding. And I believe with the motion that was passed, the 3.7 million, 2.2 to GFAR, that leaves 1.5 million. So staff would recommend 700,000 of the remaining 1.5 million.
Okay, Councilmember Sack.
I move that we utilize ARPA to balance the budget.
Vice Mayor Risto.
I'll second the motion.
Councilmember Hudis, comments?
I would agree with that, but I think we raised a point earlier in the discussion with Ms. Summers about the TOT, and I would like to see the council have another more in-depth discussion about how we accelerate that. That's not so much, I think, a Finance Commission issue as it is policy, and can we get a return on investment of further marketing efforts or other things that may piggyback off of all of this entertainment programming that we've done this year to try to recover some of that as well. So I'm supportive of the motion, but I also would like to see us try to move along some of the recovery items.
Okay, any other comments? I'm going to call the motion, call the question. Councilmember Sack.
Aye.
Councilmember Hudis.
Aye.
Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Aye.
Mayor votes aye. That passes unanimously. Okay, next, Finance Commission's 4 recommendations. We did that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Mayor. Yeah, correct. So the next item is really a broad item. It's if any council member wanted to provide any additional direction on the proposed operating budget in its totality. And so if any council members have recommendations to change anything related to the operating budget, this would be an opportunity. Depending on what a recommendation might be, and if it passed, we might have to circle back to the budget balancing. You'll recall last year, we were doing a lot of math along the way. So this is really an opportunity if there's any other thoughts by council members on the proposed operating budget.
Councilmember Sack.
No other changes, but I did want to just share that the question that I had asked of the staff and was just to make sure that the request that we had made a couple of years ago that provided an ambulance contract for mental health hospitalizations was embedded in there and would continue. Fortunately, it doesn't sound like we've utilized the contract, so it sounds like there are funds remaining, but just wanted to memorialize it through this conversation that those funds will continue to be there. Thanks.
Noted. Councilmember Hudis.
Thanks. I just had a question of staff. I saw an item, I think, of $25,000 for work on the theater. I was wondering if the theater is contributing either a profit or a loss to the town operating budget this year, and whether we have a pro forma P&L for the theater that the council is aware of. I know we're just getting our arms around things, but I was wondering if it's having a financial impact or it will in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So currently there is a little bit of a financial impact. When we took possession, one of the first things the Director of Public Works did at the time was they had a consultant go in and do an assessment of the facility. It was during the time when we were doing an assessment of all our facilities. And so when we did receive that report, they did want to do a review of the HVAC. They wanted to do a review of the elevator. So as the owner, we have assumed those costs to date. That being said, when staff issued the RFP for an operator of the theater, in the RFPs that we received, we asked for pro formas. The responses we received had a range of profitability. We did choose a manager and an operator of the theater that we are currently drafting an agreement for council's review. And that operator presented a pro forma that would show levels of profitability. And I would also remind the council, we do currently have 2 tenants associated with that building that are paying rents. And so those rents will help to offset the initial expenses of first taking possession of the theater and then transferring it over to an operator as they ramp back up into operations. Our hope is to get a draft agreement before council in the June 7th meeting, if not no later than the end of June, because we would like the theater opened as much of the summer as possible.
So if I could just sort of summarize, it sounds like we don't have anything certain enough to put in the budget one way or the other at this point, but we might have better visibility, but it wouldn't be a budget item at this point. Is that correct?
So the way staff envisions it is it would not necessarily be an operating budget item. We would want the revenues that come off the theater to remain with the theater for future CIP needs. And so there would be some type of a reserve set up where both the rents from the tenants, and whether it's a combination of percentage of profits and rent, that those monies remain with the theater. The report that the consultant gave, it will be lumpy, but over the course of the next 20 years, you can envision somewhere in the vicinity on average of about 150 to 200,000 a year in maintenance. And that's just us assuming the high maintenance items, not the day-to-day maintenance items that the operator will be responsible for. So those monies, when we come forward, the recommendation will be that they remain sequestered with the theater for future theater needs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Councilmember Hudis, did you have more? I think you're muted.
I was just going to offer a motion if it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead.
So I move to approve the FY 22-23 proposed operating budget as submitted.
Okay, I'll second. Councilmember Sayak, would you like to second?
Yes, please.
Okay,
if I may.
Yeah.
As submitted with the prior adoption of the recommendations. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll call the question. Councilmember Hudis.
Aye.
Councilmember Sayak.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Aye.
And Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
The pictures moved around on me, so I'm like, who have I called now? And then the mayor votes aye, so it passes unanimously. So we have capital budget. Would somebody like to make a motion related to capital budget? Councilmember Sayak, your hand's up.
I'll move the capital budget as proposed in our documents. So.
With the changes.
With the changes, yes.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hudas?
I did have a number of questions about capital, but if you could refresh me, are we going to be taking a more in-depth look at capital a little later in the year?
Correct. So currently at the budget level, you're assigning dollars. And then you'll recall about 3 months ago, the Public Works Director at the time came with an overview of the actual program related areas of the CIP. And we can come back with a similar presentation to actually discuss the actual project levels of the CIP.
Is staff looking for any input in direction other than sort of the total amount? I guess we've changed the total amount as well.
So the current CIP is structured with priority projects and then the addition of the one new project. That being said, the earlier conversation, there was feedback from council members where if there were additional dollars, where they would probably like emphasis. And I see the town manager might want to add more to how council could provide more input on what could possibly be done with additional dollars.
Yes, so this evening, we're really looking for approval of the base 5-year plan and particularly the program for 22-23 with the infusion of additional resources per your earlier motions this evening. We would propose that we would come back in the August timeframe to the extent the council is ready to allocate some of that money to specific projects. Now that we have a sense of what some of your interests are, it would give us time to cost those out and to figure out how best to program them. By putting money into GFAR, again, you're not obligated to spend it right away, but to the extent there are some immediate needs, we're open to that direction. But I think rather than trying to accomplish all of that tonight, we would like to come back in the August timeframe and have that more detailed project level discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would offer a second.
Okay. Any further discussion? I don't see any, so I'll call a question. Councilmember Hudas?
I would just add a couple of comments for preparing for the next capital discussion. And I'll be voting aye, but with a comment that there was work at the Finance Commission on looking at granted projects, and there was a schedule that was provided to the Finance Commission. I don't think it was in the council packet. I think it would be very valuable to understand on our capital projects, not only what the projected total would be, but what the town's total would be. And I very much applaud the work of the individuals and the department that's getting these grants. However, we're really obligated financially to understand what is the impact. So, and as we get closer on some of these, a swing of 5 or 10% in terms of what the town could contribute could add significantly to our budget and crowd out other things. So I would suggest that when we look in August that we have that view of the projects and the grants and similar to the schedule that was provided to the commission. So long comment, but I think it would be valuable for us to do that. I have a second comment as well. Mayor, I don't know if this is the time for it.
Yeah, go ahead and finish.
I was looking at the total of spending on bicycle improvements, and I would like to see a total of what we're spending over the next 2 years on bicycle improvements. I did a back of the envelope. It looked like 8 million. So I think it would be worth us looking at what is the total by taking a look at what's in the various pieces, because some of them are called Measure B, some of them are called something else, but I do think it's important that we provide that. So it's just to have that visibility. So thank you.
Okay, I'll continue calling the question since I see no more hands. Councilmember Sayak,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto,
Aye.
Councilmember Badami,
Aye.
and the mayor votes aye. So that brings us to our last one, which is consideration of the proposed donation list. Do you have a slide to show us?
I do not handy. I can pull up the budget. It'll take might take longer than a second. Are you able to put something up on the screen relatively easily? I can make you a co-host.
It's attachment 8 to the staff packet, so I don't know if we have access to the PDF of the packet.
I can pull it up.
Thank you.
So these say donation opportunities. That's opportunities for people to donate to the town, correct?
Correct. We need to identify them up front, so that way we're positioned for potential donations. And many of these are, thank you so much, are ones that we do every single year. We continued the funding opportunity for our senior services in the event additional community engagement is needed. But most of these are really the same ones that we see year in and year out. And it just provides flexibility for our partners who might wish to invest in these areas.
And Councilmember Hudis,
I was going to offer a motion.
go ahead.
I move to approve the donation list.
Vice Mayor Risto.
I second that.
Okay, any other comments? Not seeing hands. I'll call the question. Councilmember Hudis.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Risto.
Aye.
Councilmember Sayak.
Aye.
Councilmember Badami.
Aye.
Mayor votes aye. That passes. I believe we are at the end of what staff needs from us. Are there any other comments or motions from council members?
So thank you. This was a great direction and a great discussion. And I was reflecting today that 5 years ago, I had my first budget meeting with the town. So thank you for the memories.
Did it show up on Facebook?
I believe it did. I'm starting to get LinkedIn. Congratulations.
Okay. All right. So with that, I wanted to adjourn tonight's meeting in memory of Linda Seastrom, who recently passed away. And, in memory of all her years of service, great service in the clerk department to the town of Los Gatos. So with that, we are adjourned with memory of Linda.
Thank you, Mayor.